Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining the Cybersecurity Risk Assessment led by Team United Kingdom. In this presentation, we will be identifying risks and vulnerabilities which led to the attack at the Five Eyes Summit. The topics that will be covered consist of current measures, which include authentication, authorization, and access control. We will also discuss countermeasures, attack vectors, attribution, our identified vulnerability matrix, risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, as well as conclude with some mitigation recommendations. First, we want to help everyone understand what a cybersecurity risk assessment is. Cybersecurity risk assessment determines the sorted data resources that could be affected by a cyber attack, and then specifies the numerous risks that can alter those resources. Within this cybersecurity risk assessment, Team United Kingdom's sole purpose is to identify, assess, address, and ultimately diminish threats to the United Kingdom's information system. The objectives listed above will provide insight on how these tasks can be accomplished by the United Kingdom team. Authentication is one of our current measures in place. It is a process of which you verify that someone is who they say they are. Authentication is important because it enables an organization to keep their network secure by only allowing authenticated users to access its protected assets. There are three common factors of authentication. First being something you know, which could be a PIN or a password. Secondly is something you own. This could be an ID badge, a smart card, or a token. And lastly, it could be something which you are, such as biometrics, like a fingerprint or an iris scan. There are several forms of authentication. They consist of multi-factor authentication, single-factor authentication, and public and private keys. Multi-factor authentication combines two or more independent credentials, such as what the user knows, like a password, or what the user has, such as a security token, or what the user is, some sort of biometric verification. Single factor authentication refers to a single use of authentication, such as a password or a PIN. Public and private key pairs are part of the encryption process that encodes information. Both keys work in two encryption systems called symmetric and asymmetric. Symmetric encryption utilizes the same key for encryption and decryption. Asymmetric encryption utilizes a pair of keys, such as a public and private key, for better security when a message sender encrypts the message. The message encrypts the message with their private key, and the public key is sent to the receiver, and that receiver is able to decrypt the message with their key. These public and private key pairs help encrypt information that ensures data is being protected during transmission. Once authenticated, a user or process is regularly subjected to an authorization process as well to determine whether the authenticated entity should be allowed to access to the protected asset or system. A user or process can be authenticated but fail to be given access to an asset if the user wasn't granted permission to access it. Authorization is a process of establishing if a user is permitted to have access to an asset. Authorization determines what an authenticated user is and is not permitted to do. Access control lists are a list of permissions that identifies which users or system processes are granted access to objects, as well as what operations are allowed to be given on objects. Least privilege is a method limiting access rights to users and processors to the bare minimum permissions that they need in order to be able to perform their job functions. The terms authentication and authorization are often utilized interchangeably. Uh, while they both may be implemented together, these two tasks are very different. Authentication is a process of validating the identity of a registered user before allowing access to the protected asset. Authorization is a process of validating that the authenticated user has been given permission to access the requested asset. The authentication process is almost always before the authorization process. Security of a system is the primary objective. It's best to have several different countermeasures in place in order to counter attack an attack. Implementing a few of these security measures listed will ensure the security of the network is firm. The first phase in identifying an attacker is to determine all the possible attack vectors within a network. An attack vector is a weakness that a malicious actor exploits in order to gain unauthorized access to an information system and its data. These weaknesses can be exploited either passively or actively. Passive attacks are those that occur without being detected. Tools such as network sniffers, brute force tools, and key logging tools can be utilized to carry out a passive attack. Active attacks attempt to alter system assets or affect their operations. Active attacks involve some sort of modification of the data stream or creation of false data. Different types of active attacks consist of denial of service, replay attacks, and masquerading. Hardware equipment is often a target of attackers when financial decisions are being made. It's easier to purchase cheaper technical equipment. This cheaper equipment is often developed by manufacturers from within nations that have weak information security procedures. The biggest threat with these untrusted products are built in backdoors. These backdoors will allow access to a system and its data without following typical security protocols. Even though utilizing cheaper products may make troubleshooting easier, it can also make it easier for an attacker to exploit vulnerabilities. The software that information systems use are also a known attack vector. Um, Software is found on both the system level and the application level. System level software is a code that permits hardware to function properly, while application software is a code that permits tools to operate. This software vulnerabilities are security flaws, malfunctions, or weaknesses that can be exploited. Operating systems are the core of the computer environment, given access giving users a common user interface to the hardware and software installed on a PC or endpoint. Exploits on the operating system code level provides attackers the ability to steal information and damage both the hardware and software. Telecommunications is the backbone of essential services connectivity. These services include the emergency response services, utility services, transportation, and the financial sector. Telecommunication organizations are often targeted not only by script kiddies, but also by advanced persistent threats, uh, looking to create disruption to the business. These threats have the capability to access data that compromises telecommunication operations and eventually and ultimately national security. Human factors is another attack vector. Most common mistakes made by human towards systems are clicking on links, opening unknown attachments, and entering personal data or classified information into a seemingly friendly or familiar account. Attribution is determining the identity and location of an attacker. Identifying attribution can be very difficult because attackers rely on deception and a variation of different, detection methods to hide their identity. Cyber attack experts have to conduct intensive investigations when trying to determine an identity of an attacker. This includes establishing intent of motives, examining any collected digital forensic evidence, understanding the overarching situation, and analyzing historical data for trends and patterns. However, one of the most challenging things with attribution is that typically an attacker launches a cyber attack utilizing a PC or device owned by another victim that the attacker has previously compromised. Identifying an attacker can also be made difficult because attackers tend to spoof their own IP addresses and utilize other methods such as proxy servers to bounce their IP addresses around the web to confuse people looking to track them. Additionally, jurisdiction restrictions can delay determining attribution. Cybercrime that happens across borders are susceptible to jurisdiction restrictions. Law enforcement agencies and national governments have to follow official channels and request help when it comes to collecting information and evidence from a cyber attack. Country to country, laws govern how evidence can be collected and the manner that they're able to be collected vary. This could be, a huge hindrance when trying to obtain evidence from a crime that happened in another country. Vulnerability assessment is a process of defining, identifying, classifying, and prioritizing vulnerabilities in computer systems, applications, and network infrastructure, as well as providing the organization doing the assessment with the necessary knowledge, awareness, and risk information to understand the threats to the environment as well as react appropriately. The next two slides will illustrate the Team United Kingdom's high, medium, and low risk vulnerabilities that are currently on our system. Listed below are a couple of mitigation recommendations that the team has come up with in order to improve the security posture. Starting with hardware and software. Maintaining a regular update schedule for software and hardware updates and patches will help keep the system more secure. Also, installing antivirus software and using network devices such as IDSs and IPSs placed throughout the network to help detect any attempted intrusions or intrusions that were successful. Also, blocking any unused ports or closing any unused ports uh, the and decommissioning any services that aren't being used. And then also from a network traffic standpoint, shifting to utilizing more secure protocols. From a user based standpoint, educating the users that utilizes systems and applications and have access to data on um, secure practices. This includes understanding or having training regarding social engineering, um, training on how to not click on malicious links and download attachments of that you don't know who the sender was, um, as well. And then anything and everything that has been changed um, from a policy or procedure standpoint should be well documented. And they also need to be make sure that they are aligned with the security standards, um, the frameworks that are applicable to the organization or enterprise. And finally, from a fiscal standpoint, unlocking the systems and hardware, um, will make sure that somebody isn't able to physically access these systems and hardware and physically remove them from the premises. Once again, I appreciate you um, your time for during this presentation. This has been a presentation on risk assessment by the United Kingdom team. Once we have identified who a user is, what authorization level they have, and what access they should or shouldn't have, we must physically prevent them from accessing anything that they aren't permitted to have access to. As mentioned before, access control is a process of enforcing obligatory security for a particular asset. The goal of access control is to minimize the risk of unapproved access to physical and logical systems. Access control is a vital component of security compliance programs. There are several different forms of access control. This includes role-based access, which is a model of restricted network access based on the roles of an individual user within the organization. Rule-based access control, where access is permitted or denied to asset objects based on a set of rules defined by a system administrator. Mandatory access control is the strictest of all levels of control. Under mandatory access control, controls apply to the environment by having a system administrator control and configure settings. And then discretionary access control allows for each user to control access to their own data. Discretionary access control is typically the default access control mechanism for most desktop operating systems. Some of the best practices to be utilized when implementing access control consists of the following: creating an access baseline, automate user provisioning, segregating access user roles, apply the doctrine of least privilege access, terminate any orphaned accounts with extreme prejudice, and proactively monitor for unusual activity. It is important to note that the lack of adequate access control is more often the cause of security weaknesses in application than faulty authentication or authorization devices. This is simply because access control is more complex to implement and becomes even more complex as the application being secured becomes more complex in itself.